Thank you so much. I'm so excited. Every time I listen to Lynn or read her work, I walk away feeling a little bit smarter. And before we start, I also want to say that earlier in my Bitcoin education journey, I would stop and I would get worried. And I would think, am I wrong about this? Am I crazy? Is this all just going to make me lose all my money? And it's people like Lynn who I would think, you know what? If she has this much conviction, someone as smart and accomplished and experienced as her, I can't be wrong, can I? And if I am wrong, I'm wrong on the right team. So with that, let's chat a little bit about the evolution of Bitcoin, starting from this computer science experiment 15 years ago to becoming an institutional asset. And I want you to kind of look back and tell us, because you've done so much research into the history of money and the evolution of how we got to this fiat currency that does not work and doesn't hold value. So tell us a little bit about how you see Bitcoin having evolved over these last 15 years, and then we'll get into sort of where we are today.
So thanks everyone for coming out. And you know, Bitcoin's been an interesting journey. Most people that when you learn about Bitcoin for the first time, you dismiss it, or you're kind of like, yeah, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. And I went through that process just like anyone else. I mean, I had a friend that was mining it back when you could mine it on your own computer, for example. And I thought, like, that seems cool. Maybe I should get into that. And I just like, I'll figure it out next week. And then I just didn't get around to it. And then, you know, when it had like one of those other big pumps, like I think in 2013 or so, I thought maybe I should buy a little bit. I went and looked at the exchanges, and they were like really sketchy looking. And I was like, this seems like you have to put in work to make sure you don't get scammed. And I was like, I'll work on it next week, or I'll try to find time. And I kept kind of thinking, you know, I'm really rooting for those guys, but what's the chance that it's going to work? There's been a lot of failed kind of digital money projects kind of prior to that. But when you see it go through like 3+ cycles of, you know, higher highs, higher lows, most assets don't really fall 75% and then come back multiple times over the course of well over a decade. You often hear, for example, Bitcoin described as like a tulip bubble. But if you look at the actual tulip bubble, it was like this really brief, like 2 or 3 year spike in prices, and then it collapsed. Whereas Bitcoin now has a 15-year track record of grinding higher through volatility, being tested in multiple different ways, and kind of just slowly being explored by more and more people. And so for me, it was after kind of coming back to it for like the 3rd or 4th time, really saying, okay, this thing is actually hitting network effect velocity. It's actually a stable, well-designed system. And so by the time I you know, really understood it, I went from kind of 0 to 1. Like I had quite a lot of conviction on the asset. I think now, after the first 15 years were kind of like the science experiment phase. It was kind of like, is this even going to work? Is it going to reach some degree of scale? Now that the network's worth over $1 trillion, and now that large institutions are focusing on it, now that some sovereign nations either have it as legal tender or are mining it or otherwise using it, you know, it's kind of going into the next phase, which is, so the first battle's been won. You know, this panel is called "And Then We Win." But I think the next phase, like the next, call it 15 years, there's still a lot of challenges ahead. So I think now it's basically, how can you scale the network? How can you make sure the network's usable? And I still think that there's a huge education component to do. You know, it's funny, Bitcoin's 15 years old, it's worth more than $1 trillion, but you know, if you talk to 100 people about Bitcoin, probably 1 or 2 of them will have a pretty deep understanding of it, and the other 98 won't, which is on one level surprising. But on the other hand, if you talk to them about the dollar system or the fiat currency system, and you ask them like plumbing details around the financial things, they won't know that either. Kind of like how I don't know necessarily the details of every aspect of how my car functions, for example. But it is still, I think, even though it's 15 years in, it's still quite early, because you can almost cut off that first 10 years, because that was like the prototype. That was kind of like the part where it wasn't really at scale. I think it only reached kind of mass awareness in, say, 2017. And that's only a, call it 7-year period of actually getting some degree of serious liquidity, serious size, and most people have heard of it and have at least have some sort of initial opinion about it. So I think now we're going into a phase where people might have to change their opinions about it, and I think that's another challenge.
One question that I feel like a lot of us get in Bitcoin is, oh, well, there's obviously going to be a second one that's going to come and it's going to make Bitcoin irrelevant. There's Bitcoin's the MySpace and the Facebook's going to come along, right? And you have to kind of really dig into the Bitcoin network and network effects to understand why that can't happen. But it is sort of remarkable to think about the fact that it was the first iteration of this and it did work and it faced so many challenges at the beginning that it overcame. And you talk about that in Broken Money, how much Bitcoin has already overcome, and the fact that it wasn't the second or third or fourth cryptocurrency that is the king of this whole space, but it is the first. It's Bitcoin. Do you want to touch on that at all?
Yeah, so one basically way to think about technology, usually when we think of technology, the immediate thing we think of is the next technology. Like you said, what's going to beat MySpace, for example? We think, okay, Bitcoin's here, but surely they're going to come out with something bigger and better. But when you look at the history of technologies, there's obviously very different categories of technology, and one of those categories is protocols, foundational protocols. And those tend to be very long-lived once they get established. Once they kind of win out in some sort of early field of competition, they build such powerful network effects that they tend to have very long life cycles. For example, USB has been around for over 25 years now. Ethernet has been around for like 50 years. Internet protocol has been around for like 50 years. The protocols behind how email works, these have been around for decades. And decades from now, they will almost certainly still be around in some large way. And so Bitcoin is so far going through the protocol phase where some robust, relatively simple thing hits critical mass and becomes the dominant version there. And all of the new tech and all the design space is built on top of it. That's the part that can change more frequently. The apps that plug into Bitcoin, the layers built on top of Bitcoin, kind of like how the internet goes through changes at the higher layers a lot more rapidly than it goes through changes at the base layer. And I think when you look at Bitcoin through that lens, that's why it has so much staying power. Those network effects and those liquidity and those design choices from early on really start to compound over time.
How much has your personal allocation to Bitcoin changed over the years? And where do you see it now? Because obviously before, maybe it did have less chance to survive than it does when it has the penetration that it has, the adoption globally, and even the institutions now coming in, legitimizing it with products like ETFs.
Yeah, the longer it goes, the bigger it gets. Some of the tail risks slowly start to be removed from the asset. It's challenging to talk about allocation because you have to separate how much you put into the network versus how much your allocation grew because the investment did well. Right? So my allocation obviously grew quite a bit, but that's mostly from not selling my allocation and continuing to dollar cost average in. I think, one thing to emphasize is that Bitcoin is a bigger change than most people realize. They often think it's just another monetary technology that kind of goes on top of our other monetary technologies. Whereas one thing I've been trying to emphasize is that it is a pivot from how money has been working for like a century and a half. And I think that's where you realize it's not a one-decade adoption story. It's a multi-decade massive trend change in how money works. And what I mean by that is, I kind of separate money into three eras. The first era was pre-telegraph, right? So, and I focused a lot of this in my book, Broken Money, but to kind of summarize it, pre-telegraph, you had transactions and settlements moving at roughly the same speed, which is the speed of matter. You couldn't send information long distances quickly. And so the role of middlemen was, useful, like things like basic banking services on top of on top of gold, basic money transmission services on top of gold. These things were relevant, but this was a world where middlemen were relatively thin because of that transaction layer and the settlement layer having roughly the same speed. But then we entered a world ever since the telegraph and extending through today, where information can now flow around the world quickly, but settlement still cannot. And settlement basically means giving someone value that can't be reversed, right? And so, other than physical gold and things like physical transfer, there's not really been a way to do settlement of monetary value. And so what that meant is that for like 150 years, since the telegraph became widely adopted, it's only made middlemen get bigger and bigger and bigger because the speed of transactions keeps increasing. We have the telegraph, then the telephone, and then now we have the internet, and then you have obviously mobile internet. All of that keeps increasing, but there was no physical settlement that could keep up with that, and so that role was entirely filled by middlemen, basically centralized maintainers of the ledger. And what Bitcoin is that ever since 2009, we finally have fast settlement for the first time. And so that actually closes a speed gap that had been building up for a century and a half. And so almost every friction in finance was solved by another layer of centralization, right? So it's like if I want to send money to you, we use a third party, a bank. If banks want to send money to each other, they plug into like a bigger bank. If central banks around the world want to settle value with each other, they plug into whatever the biggest central bank is. And so it's just more and more layers of centralization kind of solving all of the inefficiencies of finance. But what Bitcoin does is it finally says, here's an efficient way to move value around that actually decentralizes it. And it's not just another tech on the transaction layer, it's a tech on the settlement layer. And so you can actually de-abstract and de-complexify a lot of what's happening in finance and money. And so even though it's a technology that actually can simplify a lot of things in finance. And so I view it as a massive trend change. And it's something, it's not a decade story, it's a generational story. It's a multi-decade change from how a multi-$100 trillion system works to how it's going to work in the future.
Over the next 15 years, how do you see Bitcoin evolving, one, as a store of value, and two, as a medium of exchange and as a peer-to-peer network?
I think that's going to look different in different environments, right? Because not everybody has the same monetary problems, right? So if you're in a developed country, there's a good chance you don't really have a payment problem. You don't generally find there's a lot of frictions when you're trying to buy coffee. And even in many developing countries, if you're sending money in the country, it's often fairly efficient. Where payments start to get interesting is when you look at, say, Africa, they have something like 40 currencies in Africa. Imagine all those frictions, right? And then there's something like 30 currencies in Latin America. Every one of those conversion points is a friction point. And then, of course, if you're in any jurisdiction where there's arbitrary bank freezes or mass surveillance and control of the money, there's kind of this natural incentive to get away from that. So I think that in some environments, payments come earlier because people have an acute payment problem. Whereas if you're in the United States, if you're in the UK, if you're in Europe, you probably experience payment frictions less often on a daily basis. So for people in those types of countries, I think the store of value aspect comes first. People view it as an investment. They view it as something that is competing with, say, equities or real estate in terms of long-term protection against currency debasement, and it's quite good at that role. So I think that it's just different problems for different people, and even like some around the margins, some of the non-monetary use cases. Bitcoin is basically it's the most decentralized, immutable database humanity's ever figured out how to build. And so some people want to use that to timestamp something in it, for example. And it might not be a monetary use case, but they're also, they have a problem, and then they're using it to solve a problem. So I think that the adoption patterns will vary. I think in general, store of value tends to precede payments, especially in wealthier environments. But those payment issues show up first. I mean, one of the first use cases of Bitcoin was WikiLeaks was the platform from financial services and turned to Bitcoin for donation. So the payments aspect has been there from the beginning. But for most people in developed countries, they solve their store of value problem, and then maybe later they look into their payments problem.
On the store of value side, if Bitcoin continues to eat into these other massive asset classes like real estate, like equities, like bonds, which I think it's starting to do, what are the implications and how will maybe the forces on the other side push back?
So that's a very long-term story. I mean, Bitcoin's over $1 trillion market cap. Those combined, I mean, the global wealth, depending on what measurement you look at, is something like, 500 trillion or 1,000 trillion, which is a quadrillion, right? So Bitcoin is like a fraction of 1%. I think over the long arc of time, it starts eating into savings accounts, it starts eating into sovereign bonds, it starts eating into things that we monetize for lack of good money. And this, during the phase where that's happening, that can be disruptive. Like if you're invested in things that are getting disrupted by Bitcoin, that's obviously not going to feel good. Nation states are going to push back on it in various ways. They already have, in various capacities for the past 15 years. It's going to be this ongoing story. But in the long run, not monetizing housing is good, because if you monetize houses, meaning if you're wealthy and you don't know what you do with your money, so you just buy extra houses, that's not good for people that actually want those houses as a utility good. They want them to be as cheap as possible. So there are costs of monetizing utility assets, and Bitcoin can, over the long arc of time, address that. But I think that's, even when Bitcoin is 5 times bigger than now, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to global assets. So I think that, again, this is not it's not a 1 year or 3 year, 5 year story. It's not even a 10-year story. That's a multi-decade story. And so with technologies, people often overestimate the speed and then underestimate the final magnitude. And I think that's going to be true for Bitcoin. I think people routinely overestimate the speed with which it will fundamentally change the system, quote unquote, the system. But I think that they underestimate the magnitude of what it can do over, say, a 30-year period or more. Like the transformational change that can happen with how we do payments, what things we decide to store a value in, the success rate of our investments. People, when they don't know what else to do, they invest everywhere. They just kind of invest into all sorts of malinvestments. And actually having kind of a default really good savings units increases the thoughtfulness with which you decide to actually put that money into.
It's really interesting because I was thinking of something like real estate as always being a good investment because it is more scarce than a lot of other assets. And we were talking backstage with Obi, and he brought up, well, actually, real estate has these maintenance costs, and people will want to maybe offload it if you could just hold Bitcoin and not have to worry about taking care of a property. And just the other day in my city, St. Louis, one of these big office buildings, I'm sure you've seen it in cities across the country in the US, they used to cost like hundreds of millions of dollars, selling for, no joke, this one building in St. Louis, $206 million, I don't know how many years ago, sold for $3.5 million. It's a massive high rise. And so it's like, it is being demonetized, not to Bitcoin, but can you talk about maybe, will real estate no longer be a good investment over the long run because Bitcoin will actually be an easier way to just hold your wealth?
Real estate's mainly been a good investment because it's a short on the underlying fiat currency. So when people invest in real estate, what they're really investing in is the spread between the scarcity of real estate, which is like moderate, meaning you can build new houses, you can build new properties, but it's energy intensive, it's labor intensive, it's land intensive. So that's a moderately scarce asset, and then they're shorting, they're borrowing a abundant asset, fiat currency, to do it. So for example, if you looked at house prices relative to gold, it's generally not a good investment to buy housing and use gold as your funding source. A lot of houses over the long arc of time, especially when you factor in maintenance costs and all these kind of, especially property taxes, you're going to underperform gold over the long term, which is why it wouldn't work. It only works because it works relative to fiat currency in many cases. Obviously, if you buy property in an emerging city that eventually becomes a leading city, you can do well. So the top percentile of real estate is always going to be a good investment. But the idea of just having extra property just because you don't know what else to do with that fund, that diminishes. And we see, for example, there are downsides. I mean, a lot of these property bubbles build up because people don't know what else to do with their investment. And so I think in that future, housing returns to its utility cost, which is we view it more like consumption rather than savings. I mean, I have property in the U.S., I have one property in Egypt, and ultimately what they are, as on one hand, they are consumption. We own those because we plan to use them, but also they make financial sense because they have fiat currency shorts attached to them. And so in a world where that's not as readily available, real estate's just not as good of an investment. It only seems that way because it's the one asset that you can lever 5 to 1, for example, or even higher in some cases. It's socially acceptable to lever it. It's relatively low volatility, so you can lever it. And so that makes it seem like a better investment than the actual underlying thing really is. Ultimately what you're investing in is you're investing in shorting the fiat currency with real estate.
It is fascinating because the values are appreciating, but meanwhile the actual physical properties are depreciating and often need a lot of work. And I'm always fascinated by some of the prices when you look back over the decades. A shack in certain cities is worth millions of dollars, and you're like, this is completely out of balance. I wanted to ask you a little bit about institutions and nation states, because in your earlier panel you mentioned the idea of sovereign nations printing money to buy something finite. Why aren't we seeing more nation states? And also, big institutions, like why isn't Apple putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet? Why isn't Google? Why aren't these big tech companies where a lot of the leaders we know actually have adopted Bitcoin, like Tim Cook and Mark Zuckerberg, but yet their companies aren't?
The bigger the institution, the more inertia there is against change. Right, so a small business with like one person who controls over half of it or all of it can make a decision and just stick with it very quickly, and they're mostly answerable to themselves. Whereas large institutions, people have career risk. They're not necessarily rewarded for taking like strong, edgy decisions that'll benefit them over 5 or 10 years. They're rewarded for not stepping out of the consensus or doing things that are good, 1 quarter or 1 year from now. One thing you generally find when you talk to institutions, there's a lot of people in those institutions, including at high levels, that love Bitcoin. Like any kind of major bank you can think of, there are Bitcoiners at that bank, sometimes in the executive level. You can talk to central banks, you can talk to nation states. There are people in those organizations that really like Bitcoin. But the thing is, until you hit a majority, it's almost as if there's no Bitcoiners at those institutions. You can imagine if there's a investment council and there's 9 slots and anywhere between 0 and 4 of them like Bitcoin, it doesn't matter until 5 of them like Bitcoin, until you have the majority. And so there are some individual cases where from the top, someone likes Bitcoin pretty early. For example, Fidelity is a very large institution, but the person who runs it found Bitcoin early, was interested, and so that was able to move faster than the average organization of that size. Similarly, MicroStrategy, because the CEO himself liked Bitcoin, he could push that from a top-down perspective in a way that often others can't. But those are fairly rare situations. And so instead it's you grow, and it literally gets almost no progress until you flip over to the majority. And that's why you often see no progress until there's a big move all at once.
Gradually, then suddenly, right? All right, we only have a couple minutes left. I wanted to sort of get your take on how do we win? What are the challenges ahead to really get that escape velocity of mass adoption? Because I don't know about you guys, but I know we're in a bull market, but it doesn't really feel as much like the bull market back in 2021. I don't know, maybe I'm alone on this, but it doesn't have the same energy and momentum that I felt. Maybe we'll get that after 100K or something, but how do we win?
I think 2 ways. I think the education component is still really big. And everybody has the capacity to educate because you can talk to an audience that someone else might not be able to talk to. Some people can talk to the financial institutions. Another person can talk to conservatives. Another person can talk to progressives. Another person can talk to people of their religious faith. Another person can talk to human rights activists, right? There's multiple different things that people are interested in, and they can explain here's problems in our area of care that Bitcoin is relevant for. So I think the education component is still there. But I think from a technical perspective and a kind of a financial perspective, making the user experience better is probably the next big challenge. So I think that the first 15 years were hitting scale, hitting liquidity, getting everybody to know Bitcoin, getting institutions kind of to be aware of it. I think the next 15 years, it's making sure that Bitcoin doesn't just get fully kind of absorbed into centralized systems and kind of like pushed to the periphery. Instead, it's making it so that people can actually use Bitcoin easily and that they see that it solves their problem pretty quickly. If you have to explain it and then the UX is not good, you're going to lose them. And so I think that the scaling challenges, the UX challenges, that's where I'm pretty focused on, because I think that's the thing that has to go right over the next 5, 10, 15 years.
One of the reasons I love listening to Lynn is when a debate pops up and there are really big extremes on both sides and a lot of people getting emotional, she's like right down the middle, bringing in such thoughtful analysis. So can you offer that when it comes to some of these, I think, polarizing topics, including institutions? Like with the ETFs, there's one side that's like, this is basically us giving away Bitcoin to Wall Street. And then on the other side, it's like, no, this is a way for us to gain more adoption. It's an entry point. How do you like stay down the middle, and what are your perspectives on that?
So it depends on the topic. My goal is not to stay in the middle by default. There's actually a fallacy of assuming that the middle's correct, where it's not always correct. Sometimes one side is just correct. So the goal is not to stay in the middle. The goal is to be able to steel-man both sides of an argument, meaning be able to articulate both sides of an argument and understand what the other person's saying and then come to a view, which often will be somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, but not necessarily. With the ETFs, the way I phrase it is that Bitcoin didn't create the ETFs. Bitcoin is just Bitcoin. The fiat system made ETFs for Bitcoin. And so that's something that the fiat system decided to do. And I think that it was inevitable. If you go to $1 trillion asset, you're going to get ETFs made on you. That's part of the. It's both good because it scales it to more people, and it can be bad because it can be centralizing. So this was a test that Bitcoin was always going to have to go through. Fee congestion on the main chain, that's a test that Bitcoin was always going to have to go through. Debates about scaling, that's a challenge that Bitcoin is always going to have to go through. So instead of viewing each one of these things as a catastrophe or some sort of big thing, it's like, no, this is just another step along the way that anyone with foresight would see that this is a test that Bitcoin has to go through. And so I think that it's the best way to look at that is to say, what can I do to make sure Bitcoin meets that challenge well? And of course, millions of people can all have their own little way of making sure that it gets past those challenges.
All right, final minute. Anything you want people to walk away with or be thinking about or maybe be asking themselves when it comes to Bitcoin? Because I know many people in the room are probably very big believers, allocating a lot. Maybe some people are very new. What do you want them to walk away with and be thinking about?
I think the first thing is just to make sure that you understand it. Just do your best. Read. There's plenty of books out there. It's very different than it was 5 years ago in terms of getting up to speed on it. I think educating yourself is the best because instead of trying to say share it with others, you want to just be in a position where people ask you about it because you're knowledgeable on it. It's solving problems for you, whether it's store of value, whether it's payments, whether it's some other technical thing. Bitcoin is solving a problem for you, and when people see that you've solved that problem, they might come and say, how are you solving this problem? Or can you explain this Bitcoin thing to me? Versus going out and always kind of aggressively trying to market it. But I think that's the main thing is let Bitcoin help your own life and understand it and go from there.
And read Broken Money. Lyn Alden, everyone.
All right, everyone's been introduced, but I got Chris, Thomas, and Pete to my right. And I'm going to start it all the way over there with you, Pete, because it's the name of the conference. I have no idea what the cheat code is. What is the cheat code, Pete?
Yes, you do. So I thought I'd come up with this. I thought I was really clever, and I was saying it everywhere. And then Danny, bless Danny, said, it was Jonathan from 1031 who came up with this. So hats off to Jonathan. It was just this idea that resonated with me. I've always wanted, if you've listened to my podcast long enough, you'll know I kept saying, I'm going to buy my local football team. But I never really knew how to do it because it's really, really expensive to buy a football team. And to be successful, you need to have a very good business. And most local football teams, their revenue comes from any local sponsors they get, anyone who comes through the gates and buys a ticket and a burger. So the revenues are limited. And it wasn't until one of those kind of shower moments I thought, hold on, if I make us the Bitcoin team, I get to access this global community of psychopaths and then access this global community of sponsors. And so once I realized straight away, I was like, oh, I should make us the Bitcoin team. And I did it straight away and I announced it. And as what happened, I mean, like the guy there with the Bedford t-shirt, I was like, look, there's lots of people with Real Bedford merch. So people from all around the world who've got no connection with Bedford are wandering around with a t-shirt saying Bedford. And that's good revenue for us. We have people streaming our games. We have sponsors like, I mean, you go to our ground, most places it'd be like Jim's Butchers and, you know, maybe a local, local accountants. And we've got Gemini, Galaxy, Iron, all these huge global companies. And
Luxor,
yeah. There's more, Coin Corner. And so what that has meant is that this global community that's part of us has enabled us to essentially level up and, as a business, outcompete all the other football teams locally. And so then it just resonated. It's like, well, Bitcoin's a cheat code. You can use that for anything. It's some guy emailed me. He said, I'm a plumber. How do I use the cheat code? I was like, well, duh, you become the Bitcoin plumber. And when you advertise yourself, if you're near me, I'm going to use you because, one, I can pay you in Bitcoin, and two, I kind of trust you a bit more than other Bitcoiners because I know we're going to think on the same wavelength. So I just see Bitcoin as a cheat code because you get to access this global community of amazing psychopaths who are getting wealthier and wealthier. And so I think almost any business or any individual can use that.
So the cheat code, you obviously have a big Bitcoin media operation with what Bitcoin did. That's a Bitcoin business. But your point is you could have a non-Bitcoin business that integrates with this global audience, right?
Yeah,
That's the real Bedford.
Yeah, I'll pass to Thomas here and then chip in if I think I've anything to add. But we've got essentially a very similar business in that even if Bitcoin's in a bear market or there's no interest, people still want to go to football matches, people still want to get wasted.
Yeah, I mean, okay, that's a fair point. Well, Thomas, I mean, PubKey has...
I'll drink responsibly.
I would say Bedford is poised to be the next PubKey and what I mean by that is that PubKey has become a global destination in New York. By the way, it is excellent separately. It's not just a fluke, but I don't know, how does it relate in your mind, or also just tell us what PubKey has become? It's been over a year. It's been
almost 2, coming up on 2 years. So PubKey is a pub in Manhattan in New York City. And it's most of the time just a normal dive bar, tavern, public house, whatever. And sometimes we get described as a Bitcoin themed bar. Whenever that happens, I kind of bristle because Bitcoin is in the DNA of the company and the people that run the place, but it's not the entire point of the business. And I think that's similar to Real Bedford in many ways. We host free open to the public Bitcoin education every Thursday. Sometimes that bleeds into Wednesdays and Tuesdays. There's a lot of interest around that stuff. But most of the time you can just pop in and have a pint and talk to people because it's a nice local pub. It's been a dive bar for 100 years and the location is now PubKey, but the location always had that sort of in its DNA. And this was born out of really a confluence of events in COVID. We saw a lot of these types of establishments die out in New York City. A lot of these neighborhood taverns are typically run by families or friends that have been at it for a while. And when things got very difficult from the hospitality perspective in New York City, a lot of them just died and went away. And that was happening to the previous bar in PubKey's location as well. At the same time, New York kind of drove out a lot of the Bitcoin community. A lot of hardcore Bitcoiners that were New Yorkers, just mainstays at New York Bit Devs, the Socratic seminars run by Jay and a great team, Chain Code Labs. We saw some, depleting of those numbers for Austin, Nashville, other places. And one of the canned phrases that I have, the only thing that's been declared dead more frequently than Bitcoin is New York City. And neither one's going to die. But this was sort of a combination of those two passions, where we're able to establish a public meeting house that is kind of a community hub for Bitcoiners. And out of the gate, that's only like 20 to 25% of our business, but it's extraordinarily passionate, loyal, fan base or customers that are going to provide the drumbeat, and then also provide a better first touch for pre-coiners, right? I don't like no-coiners or shit-coiners. Everybody's a pre-coiner in my opinion. They just haven't gotten there quite yet. So when you look at the online discourse on Twitter and Reddit and Bitcoin Talk, it's always such a shit show. People have to be a little bit more normal, particularly after COVID, to come to a place and have a beer and have an interesting conversation around, revolutionary technology. And that's what taverns have been doing for, millennia, right? So,
Quick question. Do you know how many bars there are in New York?
I'm sorry?
How many bars are there in New York?
How many bars?
Yeah, guess.
Countless. I have no idea.
1,000?
It's got to be like 5,000.
Yeah, it's got to be like, just an obscene number.
So in terms of a cheat code, the interesting thing about this is me and Danny have to go to New York to do 2 to 3 times a year with the podcast or events to do stuff. Now when we go, we always pick a hotel that's near PubKey, and it's a bit like the Cheers. It's the place they know your name. It's the only bar we go to, so we're there most days. And that's not just a drink, it's to hang out, or there's an event on. And so that's kind of what I mean by the cheat code. That's the magnet in New York that we're drawn to. And you'll turn up one day and you'll be in there, and there'll be American Hodl's in there, or Alex is in there, or Sebastian from Galaxy's there, or Nick from Casa, all these people you know. So every day you're bumping into people you know. So it's just a magnet for Bitcoiners. And what I see that with your business, you could have a very successful bar. You got a great smash burger, you make a great old fashioned. I'd be
Shout
very
out
happy
Smash
there
Burger.
normally.
Phenomenal burger, truly.
But the Bitcoin bit is like an accelerant that gives you a competitive advantage over other bars.
Yeah, I mean, it's a highly specialized community that we target, and that provides a steady drumbeat. That's a foundation for us, but we accept everybody. Everybody can come in. But if you're into if you're into Liverpool, right? There are Liverpool bars. There are Chelsea bars, whatever, like sports bars. You can kind of think about it in that sense, but, Bitcoin is a very broad, far-reaching community. People that are interested in energy and mining come to PubKey for different reasons than people that are interested in a lot of the HRF initiatives or institutional investing or hardcore core development or lightning development. So, it sort of attracts all kinds.
What team is your bar?
Huh? We're Bedford team. Are you kidding?
Thomas
we show most of the games. We got to push them to night games, though. We're not open yet for a lot of the games.
Time difference is a little tricky, but he has Real Bedford on quite often. I want to bring Chris into this conversation because Chris helps businesses accept Bitcoin, and then I want to ask you guys about, I don't know, the boring accounting of Bitcoin. But Chris, tell us what you do and why businesses are starting to accept Bitcoin, why they should, why they like it, what you're hearing from them.
Thank you, Alex. So for those who don't know who I am, my name's Christopher Gordon. I'm co-founder of a business called Bridge to Bitcoin. And we're essentially a marketing consultancy that onboards businesses to accept Bitcoin. We don't own any hardware. We don't own any software, contrary to what a lot of people think. They often go, oh, can we use your hardware? Can we use your point-of-sale machine? Can we use your software? No, we don't have any. We just put business owners in contact with a solution that we think is most appropriate for their business. And Pete summarized perfectly what we do in so much what the cheat code does. So I love the example of the plumber. So anyone can use the cheat code as far as we're concerned. All you have to do is start accepting Bitcoin. Peter called you a psychopathic, untapped customer base. And that's what you are. You are the best customer base a business owner has ever seen. So invariably what happens when we onboard a cafe or a coffee shop, the catchment area for Bitcoiners is ridiculous, absolutely absurd. People drive 2 hours just to have a frigging slice of cake and a tea. And then they get there and they walk through the doors and they go, excuse me, do you accept Bitcoin? And the person behind the bar goes, yeah. Wow, that's brilliant. That's fucking amazing. Can I take a photo? Great, okay, yeah, take a photo. And then they'll video, and then they'll put it on social media, and then they'll be ridiculously thankful and grateful. They're your most positive customer that business has ever seen. And the magic thing is that you guys become a fantastic Trojan horse for these businesses and business owners. And they learn about Bitcoin in their own time. So they might not be maxis yet, they might just be accepting Bitcoin to increase their footfall and their revenue. And that's what we advocate. So we pitch up booths at normal trade shows, normally next to the likes of SumUp or other payment providers. And our pitch is, you can open your business to an untapped customer base. And it can be a plumber, it could be a restaurant, it could be a cafe. Peter introduced us to the cafe next door, and we onboarded them on Tuesday. And you guys, like Psychopaths, have turned up in droves. They absolutely love it. You guys have been tweeting about it. They've got extra custom. We've onboarded the food trucks this morning. So Pete gave us heads up, said, right, I've prepped them. I've told them that they're going to be accepting Bitcoin. We set them up. It's really easy. You guys, most of you are Bitcoiners, so it'll be even easier to do it for you. They absolutely loved it. The Italian food truck is all in now. They are hodling thanks to you guys. So well done, everyone here. So the Italian food, they're not cashing out. They now want more Bitcoin. One of the other food trucks, one of the other employees was going, so how can I buy £200 worth of Bitcoin now? I said, oh, okay, right, we'll talk about exchanges. And just before I forget, about the Italian food truck, the owner was on the phone when a few people were trying to pay. So I've got a request. Ian, you owe them £9. David, £16.50. And Henry, I think that is, you owe them £1.50. So if you haven't settled your bill, please do that before you go.
I love this. Hey, I just want to clarify, too. I think, a psychopath is a narcissist who doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. That's not what Bitcoiners are. I think we're talking about the devotional.
Very passionate and loyal.
Exactly. So I think but it is true. There is Bitcoin is more than a technology. It's more than a new form of money. It is a revolution and a movement, and that movement is global.
I like to call it a renaissance. It just has a softer edge to it. Revolution sort of conjures images of blood and guts, and there might be. But if we call it a renaissance, I think that people...
It's a Bitcoin renaissance.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you a funny story about the cafe next door. So about a week ago, I was trying to go around Bedford to orange pill companies to accept Bitcoin, so you all would have places to spend. And the first two places were complete duds. They obviously thought I was just like some weirdo trying to scam them. It's like, oh, hi, I've got a conference with all these people coming down and it's Bitcoin. They weren't interested. So I went into the cafe and I was like, okay, here we go again. So I said, hi, I've got a conference on next door on Friday. There's a bunch of Bitcoiners coming in. I own a local team called Rail Bedford. And the lady went, oh, my son plays for you. I was like, what? Yeah, Ollie Swain is currently injured, centre half. He plays for us. And so we immediately had the trust because of that. So then we had the conversation. I spoke to her boss, Rachel, and then explained to her and said, I will guarantee you the money. I can give you the money in advance. We'll buy the Bitcoin off you. And she went, no, I want to keep the Bitcoin. I think this is the future.
Let's go.
And I think...
Let me just add to that. And then I was like, oh, shit, this place is vegan. We've got like a bunch of carnivores coming here. No, then about 3 hours later, I got an email from two people who come here and said, look, we've got weird dietary needs. Where do we go for lunch? I was like, I think I know what you're going to say. And I was like, what are your dietary needs? They said, oh, we're vegan. I was like, I've got a place for you.
Yeah, that's difficult. Which one do they bring up first, Bitcoin or vegan? If they get really into Bitcoin, it's going to be like a little bit of a competition there.
But just to pick up on what you said, it's a graft to onboard businesses, Pete. So you might think that Peter, with his stature and his presence, could easily onboard a load of businesses and say, I'm virtually the mayor of Bitcoin, you need to accept Bitcoin. But that's not how it works. And if you speak to businesses yourselves to try and board your local cafe, the likelihood is most will say no. So it is a numbers game. So don't be disheartened. But what I would say is be the change that you want to see in the world. So walk the walk, don't just talk it. So start accepting Bitcoin in your business. If you work for someone, speak to the business owner and just sow the seed.
I want to ask, let's sort of double click on something that both of you guys have mentioned. Pete, you said that she wants to hodl her Bitcoin, right? You said they make those great, what are they called? Zias that we had, the Italian food truck out there was amazing, by the way. If you didn't have one, go get one that was so good. They're hodling, right? Well, I mean, what if you have, so a couple questions on this. If you're a business, one, what if you can't hodl it? It's operational capital. Like, how difficult is it to account? Let's start there. Like, all three, both of your businesses accept Bitcoin. Thomas, PubKey accepts Bitcoin. What happens to that Bitcoin? Is it hard to deal with? Or have you figured that out?
So
Does it integrate with your other operational stuff?
yeah, look, we figured it out for now, right? And at a certain point, like, a bar or restaurant is, pretty high velocity as in terms of the cash flow. 90% of the transactions are credit card, debit card, 5% cash, USD, 5% in Bitcoin. So we're able to take that, inflow of Bitcoin and hold on to it. So far, we have held all of the Bitcoin that comes in, but we're still paying out in cash on the tax, the tip, gratuity for staff. At a certain point, if it ends up being 50%, less than that, right? If it's like 25, 30%, then we may need to dip into that for operating expenses. New York and the regulatory environment also creates another wrinkle. It makes it easy. I guess New York City makes it a little bit easier to hodl because from a tax perspective, accounting, so on and so forth, it's just you get rid of a lot of complexity as long as you're just
So you're saying oppressive regulation is good for hodling?
Yeah, 100%. And we also use Lightning for a while. We had on-chain and Lightning. It just makes sense from an operational perspective. Bartenders waiting around to make sure that a transaction clears 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something like that, is not the best customer experience, and it's also not the best for the staff, right? There's a lot of anxiety waiting for that transaction. So far, Lightning only has had zero hiccups. We've only had one hiccup, and that was on-chain. Somebody was trying to send a transaction from their Coinbase wallet. So that one hung out there for quite a bit. But going off of what Chris was saying earlier, there is a bit of a ritual. We use Zeus for our point of sale. And it's a separate POS system if somebody wants to pay in Bitcoin. And there's a little bit of a ritual where they go get the iPad and they set up the transaction and it clears instantaneously and there's a QR code, blah, blah, blah. And if there's one of those pre-coiners that's sitting next to them, one of these transactions happening, there's almost always a question, like, what the hell was that? Or, looking at the other Bitcoin stuff is like, wait a second, was that just a Bitcoin transaction? And that sparks, curiosity and a different type of conversation. It's the difference between the push and the pull. Like, if Bitcoiners are going around door to door, like knocking on doors saying, like, have you heard of the Church of Satoshi? That's a different way to start a conversation than somebody asking a question out of curiosity, like, what just happened there? So that's what we try to help facilitate, and I think the same are happening with these other two organizations as well.
Yeah, it depends on the business. I did get caught out once with the media company. We had a significant sponsor pay entirely in Bitcoin, and what I didn't realize at the end of the year is that even if the price of Bitcoin dropped, we still had to pay corporation tax on the value of the Bitcoin at the time we received it, and it was a real kick, but that because you don't want to sell the Bitcoin, and so operationally on our cash flow it was an issue. So we've had to plan around that. We have to now think in the future if we want to hodl this, what is our resistance to price drops. On the football club, it's different. It's very similar to Thomas's company, PubKey. 5 to 10% of the transactions are in Bitcoin, and we just have we just send it all to one single wallet. We use OpenNode for some of our payments. We use CoinCorner for some others, but we just consolidate these and send these to a Bitcoin address. And I'm pretty sure, just in terms of people buying merch on the website and buying things at the ground, we've got about over 1 Bitcoin now in a wallet. So you're talking like 55,000.
Whole corner.
But the average price, we know that the Bitcoin's coming is below that. And so that's really cool. And we can just leave that there, forget about that for years. We're just going to keep letting that build up and up and up and just forget about that, because I see that as like us putting cement under the house and just ensuring the foundations of the football team for whatever kind of difficult moments the club might face in the future. So yeah, it's such a low amount that we can just put it away and forget about it.
So yeah, if here in the UK and Europe, there's a popular option, and they're the sponsors, one of the sponsors of the conference today, and also sponsors of Real Bedford, Coin Corner. So Coin Corner allow a business to flip that Bitcoin at point of sale into your local currency. So the important thing for a business owner to realize is that you continue to invoice in your local currency. Just because you're accepting Bitcoin doesn't mean to say you start pricing in sats. You still charge £10 for 2 pints of beer. It just so happens that Bitcoiner will give you £10 worth of Bitcoin, but the solution can flip it straight back into the £10 for you. So in short, you invoice in £10 and you get £10. The Bitcoin all happens outside of the business. So that's a really good first step for new business owners who are completely new to Bitcoin, or who are just interested in solely the extra revenue and the footfall.
Because then they don't have to change anything. They just,
Yeah, exactly.
it's a different type of credit card for them.
Exactly. It's a bit like, I often say to business owners, let's say they're in a restaurant, did you know you take US dollars in your restaurant? I go, no, we don't. I go, you do. If an American walks in and he pays with his American credit card.
Yeah, what happens?
Yeah, his bank takes the American US dollars and it gets flipped by a payment provider. That's effectively what's happening with Bitcoin.
So it doesn't have to be difficult, is your point?
No, it's actually really easy, and it's really easy to integrate into current systems as well. So at Peter's Bar, we put in a Bitcoin button on the tender types, so the staff can choose card, cash, or Bitcoin. Same with the cafe here, same with the Italian restaurant around the corner. It's really easy. But actually, what it boils down to is how much Bitcoin are you actually going to get? We're still really early in the space. The amount of Bitcoiners that are going to come through your doors or come and use your plumbing service is pretty minimal. And we often say to businesses, look, we can't guarantee you're going to become a millionaire by accepting Bitcoin. If you've got a failing business, Bitcoin probably won't save it. So this is just, at the moment, a way of tapping into this customer base that you're not tapping into at the moment. So tap into this customer base. If your margins are really tight, okay, flip it. But as the Italian food truck has realized, actually, their margins aren't that tight. They can just keep the Bitcoin. They've realized what this hard sound money is. And they're like, actually, they've very quickly gone, I should just hold on to this asset. Because, yeah, we've taken a small amount of takings compared to how much we're going to take this month. I don't need this small amount of cash.
Let's talk about if you do hold on to it then, because that's sort of the other question I had is, Thomas, where's PubKey's Bitcoin? Is it back there in a ledger in the back of the bar? And don't answer that. But in reality, how does a business store their Bitcoin?
Behind
in
the
a secure,
mirror
right?
bathroom.
I mean, truly, you don't have it on like an iPhone single sig wallet, just right. I mean, it's got to go somewhere that's safer for a business. How does a business custody?
It's around your neck, isn't it? Can I see it?
It's a multi-custodial solution, right? So some sits in an exchange, some like...
Wait, you're saying the Bitcoin is not
Hold
literally
on.
in the pub?
If
I can't just break into the Bitcoin in the pub like in Zoolander? All right.
if
course not.
you answer this completely honestly, there's some bits of it that are a bit ropey. Like, so I'll be honest, we have a Unchained for the football club. We have an Unchained multi-sig, which has our float and our treasury. Obviously, we understand Unchained is, it's a like very reputable multi-sig custodial solution. But the pathway from the football club to that, it's a bit ropey at times. Yeah. One of the things, like, I don't know if people remember, Blue Wallet used to have separate Lightning. You could create separate Lightning wallets. You have multiple Lightning wallets on your phone. So we had one for what Bitcoin did. And then when we put on an event, we had a separate one for that event. We had one for the football club. We had one for Donations Football Club, all in one nice, neat location. Then Blue Wallet pulled that service. And now I've got 6 different apps on my phone because most of them only allow you to have one wallet. I've got Wallet of Satoshi. I've got Moon. I've got Breeze. And so I have a different one for each business because nobody solved that solution. And at the end of the month, I control those and I control the keys, and I have to then do the transfers to put it into the cold storage solution. But I have to leave a small amount in the float because sometimes we pay for things in Bitcoin. And so that bit there hasn't been solved very well that I can find. And that is a risk. There will always be certainly hundreds, if not low £1,000 that are in different solutions at any one point as we get to the end of the month. Please don't come and kill me. Yeah, it's something that needs solving.
Yeah, particularly like.
What?
What's that?
La Teresa?
Yeah.
Did I pronounce it correctly?
The Italian restaurant, we had dinner last night.
La Terraza.
Teresa? They
good.
accept Bitcoin. Yeah, cool. Are you off there now? All right, have
This guy works for La Terraza for sure.
Appreciate you, man.
The tomahawk steaks last night were really good, in fairness. So shout out to them.
So Chris,
fuck
like,
is going on?
is this a question that people? Is this a question that the businesses get concerned about? You say they want to accept Bitcoin, they either end up getting a lot of it, or let's say it goes up in value, and now they're like, "Crap, I've got all this Bitcoin sitting in this hot wallet." Like, do you also advise them on that, or is this something that comes up?
So we don't advise them directly, but we'll direct them to some learning materials. Shout out to Ben Perrin, BTC Sessions. So we often send some of his material over to businesses because inevitably, yes, they'll start off with a Lightning wallet, as Peter talked about, because that's kind of a necessary step because you don't want to be accepting small amounts of Bitcoin on chain because then you have unspendable UTXOs. So you start off with a Lightning wallet. Invariably, that builds up to a point where you want to transfer that over to a hardware wallet, and that's where we'll send them to Ben Perrin's work. And then we're open to discussions with them if they want to have a conversations, but they can normally work it out. BTC Sessions' videos are really good.
Those videos are great. Ben has great content. I learned how to use my cold card queue because of his video. Shout out BTC Sessions. I want to go backwards now a little bit and get back into the cheat code broadly. I've heard, Thomas, you describe pubs in general as third places. What is the thesis here? Why do those matter? Is that, and then just like rant to us a bit more about why PubKey is awesome.
I think also football pitches qualify as a third place, but a third place is something other than your home or your office, a place where you can go that you can socialize with people that are not necessarily in your family or your immediate workplace.
Where everyone knows your name.
Huh?
Where everyone knows your
That's
name.
exactly what I was thinking. Where everyone knows your name.
Where everyone knows your NIM. But
solid.
I think that these things, these places were hit very hard because of COVID. And there was also an effect on these places before COVID, just with, social media and, Netflix and the death of, movie theaters and things like that. Not that movie theaters are dead. I don't mean to offend any AMC supporters or anything like that. But, I think pubs and taverns have held a very, very special place where you could discuss difficult concepts, difficult ideas, find commonality, consensus over, social lubricants for the most part. I think sports historically have served that purpose. I'm an American, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a big New York Yankees fan. It used to be different. You used to be able to, bring a family of four, and it wouldn't cost many hundreds of dollars to go out to a ballpark. And baseball games are quite long, and they used to be much more inherently social gatherings than they are today. Today, it's a bit corporatized and overdone. Maybe that's the same for football here.
And you used to win World Series.
Yeah. So, look, I think the concept of third places as it pertains to Bitcoin are tremendously important because these ideas are not necessarily accessible to most people. So by making it accessible in a place like that, where it's not the point, but it's an underwriting current or theme, is I guess one of the underpinning ideas of PubKey, and so far we've been seeing it play out. I mean, again, free open to the public programming every Thursday. We have people that wander to the back, and they come in, they have a pint by themselves, and it's just well, I might as well go see what that's about. And they end up staying, they end up engaging, asking a question, talking afterwards, and that's been really cool to see.
Yeah, these third spaces, meet spaces, for when it's me and Danny are traveling, making the show, they're really useful. Whenever we're in a city that has one, we spend a lot of time there, whether it's say New York or whether it's Austin, and I'm very bullish on them. I think they're going to continue to grow, and they're good for two reasons. There's a social aspect, But usually you end up discussing like concepts or business ideas with people. Me and Thomas have discussed Rail Bedford a lot. Now, PubKey is a Rail Bedford bar. We text relentlessly about it. And I just, it's almost like oh God, I can sound like pomp, but it's like a virus spreading. And so you've just got these different nodes that can appear everywhere, and they're all starting to merge. And so it's like anyone here, you can start a meetup, or you can start a third space where you are. And, Edgar is here somewhere over from Minneapolis. He's the biggest Rail Bedford fan in the world. He's amazing. This is the second time he's come over. He's here a week. He has a meetup for the Rail Bedford games, and at like 9 a.m, 15 people come and watch a Rail Bedford game and hang out and talk about Bitcoin. And so anyone here can do that, but they're becoming super important. If I go into a city, I know there's a Bitcoin meetup, we're going to it because there's just a bunch of people that we know are going to be on the same wavelength that you want to hang out with. Otherwise, in a city, it's not like you're going to just normally go into a random bar and just go up to somebody and say, "Hi, can I be your friend?" Because it's a bit weird. But you will go to a meetup because Bitcoin is all on that same wavelength.
That's a great pickup line.
Hello.
Just to loop that back to onboarding businesses. So that's a big part of our pitch when we speak to new businesses, is that not only will you attract this untapped customer base, but invariably what happens is they will set up a meetup at your cafe or pub or restaurant, and we're seeing this. So big shout out to a guy called Ashley Giles on Twitter. He's excellent at doing this in the UK. So he'll onboard a local business, and then he'll have his local meetup there, and he'll hire the whole pub out or the whole restaurant, and bam, normally on a quiet night, a quiet evening when they wouldn't ordinarily get hardly any trade, and bam, they've got £3,000 through the door. They've had to do nothing other than say, yes, I'll accept Bitcoin. We put in place a payment rail which costs nothing, and suddenly they've got this extra source of revenue coming to their business. But for us, meetups are good for me personally, they're good for two things. They're good for numbers, because I can then go to business owners and say, yeah, there's a meetup in Bedford, or there's a football club, they attract 500 people every year for a conference, and every month they have a meetup and they attract X amount of people. So I can pretty much guarantee you've got this X amount of customers in this area. But secondly, tapping into what you were saying, Thomas, it's good for the soul. The number of Bitcoiners who I've met who've come to my meetup, or I've seen at other meetups, where it's been their first ever time that they've met Bitcoiners in real life. It's a beautiful thing to watch. You can kind of see the weight fall off their shoulders, and it's like they've met family. They're like, these are my people.
How many people here is it their first conference?
Let's go. Hey, give yourselves a round of applause. That is awesome.
So my point being that the meetup space is really important for businesses and also for us as people, because we are so new. So big shout out to all the meetups in the UK and across the globe. You're doing a really important job. Keep going. If you don't have a meetup in your area, start one up. But even better, go to a local pub or a local cafe and go, I've got this bunch of people, we need a place to meet up, but they'll choose a location that accepts Bitcoin over one that doesn't. What do you reckon? Would you accept Bitcoin and us as some extra custom?
We get this question a lot at PubKey. Start small, be consistent, and be accessible. That's really it. And it'll grow from there. And you'll find people that will also be supportive. And if you're able to build consistency once a month, once a quarter, even, other people will start to bolster that effort, and it'll grow from there.
When we took over the football club, the first half a season, we used to get 40 to 50 people a game. The first full season, we averaged 180 with the largest crowd of 321. This year, we've averaged about 250. Our largest crowd's 471. Until tomorrow, where we think we maybe have 600-700, hopefully. Not all of them are Bitcoiners, but what certainly happened is the Bitcoiners helped accelerate the message. And also, we have a meetup once a month before a game where maybe 50, 60 people will come. So like I say, these things can work anyway. Bitcoin is like an accelerant. It's like a bit of icing on top of it that can make the difference.
And for me, it's also about the networking. When you go to meetups or when you start accepting Bitcoin in your business, there's this super networking effect. And hopefully you guys are experiencing it today. You'll be meeting other Bitcoiners and you'll be going, you produce this product that I'm interested in, or I know someone else is interested in. So get out and network, start accepting Bitcoin. It's really simple. If If you want to accept Bitcoin and you're not sure, get in contact, bridgetobitcoin.com, send us an email, DM us on Twitter. We'll get you set up. It's really easy. We set up the businesses here in no time. It's much easier than you think, and we can integrate it into EPOS terminals as well.
And Chris's business model is amazing because they don't charge for anything or make any money. I don't know how they do it. But Chris will turn up with a team of people and set everything up, and I still can't understand how they make any money. It's incredible.
It's a terrible business model. Pete doesn't understand it because it's a business model that doesn't work in so much as a Bridge to Bitcoin hasn't been designed to make money. We're essentially just Bitcoin philanthropists. And people say, well, people often go, I don't get it. Why are you doing it? What's in it for you? Well, I guess I'm a stakeholder in Bitcoin. So one of my things is I want to live on a Bitcoin standard. So the more places that accept Bitcoin, the closer I am to living on a Bitcoin standard. I want Bitcoin to be ubiquitous at the end of the day.
Is that what you do? You go to like your favorite restaurant, and you're like, I really would prefer if I could spend Bitcoin here. You say, oh man, I love this apparel. Can you please accept Bitcoin?
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. Last question here. We're almost out of time, but I just want each of you, if you could just tell us what's next. What's next for Real Bedford? We have a game tomorrow, a match. What's next for Real Bedford? What's next for Pubkey? What's next for Bridge?
We do have a game tomorrow. Be in this room at 4:40. I'm going to tell you what's next. I'm going to blow your fucking minds.
All right.
Honestly, I'm going to blow your minds at 4:40.
So you got your cooking. You got some stuff in the oven?
Unbelievable thing I got to tell you.
Thomas, what's next for Pubkey? What's your grand vision?
A Pubkey in every city. We want to expand. I think next... You know, we would love to be in London. We would love to be in Bedford, UK, anywhere really. I think next up for us is Philadelphia. It's close enough for us to quality control. The connective tissue is our Pubkey Media House. All the things that we put on, we want to be able to provide a virtual, digital, whatever experience. You can watch the video, listen to the podcast, and participate in the conversation if you can't be in the room. But we want to expand these things and create a network of Pubkeys. Whether that's us doing it or partnerships or franchisement, that's stuff we're still working out, and there's a lot of regulatory complexity with bars in general. But yeah, that's the hope.
Love it. Chris, what's next for Bridge to Bitcoin?
More businesses that are accepting Bitcoin payments. All businesses accepting Bitcoin payments. If you have one, get in touch. We'll get you set up really quickly and easily. So hopefully it'll be ubiquitous soon, and it'll just be something that exists.
Awesome. Chris Gordon, Thomas Packia, Peter McCormack. Thank you so much.